Hi, I'm Christopher Walker. Today we're going to start our look at the Cambridge FCE exam and the FCE for schools. These have both changed this year, 2015, so there's quite a lot for us to look at. We're going to start with the writing paper today because really, given the amount of time before the exam, if you start working on your writing now, you should be able to see some improvements for it. Now, for this whole series of video lectures, you'll need a copy of either the specifications or the sample paper that Cambridge produces for this exam, and the link for that is given at the bottom in the description for the video. Okay, let's have a look at the paper itself. Now, the writing paper used to include a letter at the start. In the first part you had to write a letter. It was either formal or informal. Well, this is different now. As we'll see later, this has changed to being an essay, and the reason for that is really that Cambridge wants all of their exams to reflect the growing importance of academic English. Now, for students wanting to get into a university in England to study there, for example, they want to make their qualifications a little bit more relevant. You have 1 hour and 20 minutes to complete 2 pieces of writing, so the time is quite clearly a bit of a pressure for you, especially now that the 2 pieces are both the same length. They're between 140 and 190 words each. In the past, the first piece of writing was a little bit shorter than the second, but now they have an equal amount of the length is equal, so you need to devote really the same amount of time to each. So before we look at some examples of what's actually in the exam, we're going to have a look at what the examiners want from you. They look at several different areas, but it's always the same regardless of which writing task it is. So, the grammar focus is the same even if it's a report or a review or an article or what have you. So the first thing really is the content, and as you're writing, ask yourself, is your writing relevant to the task? Have you gone off on a different point? Are you writing about something that you want to write about instead of what you have to write about? Always consider the feelings of the target reader. Now, this is different for every piece of writing, and we'll go into that in more detail later. But really, if you remember who the reader is going to be and you try to write for them, then you're going to end up with a much more successful piece of writing. Next, we look at your communicative achievement. Have you used the format of the task to really communicate what you want to? For example, if you're writing a report but you write it as if it was a letter, then you've not really made best use of the function of a report. Cambridge wants to see some evidence of the introduction of complex ideas, not just simple ideas, but more complex ideas, and generally the writing should be quite interesting. Next, we'll be looking at organisation. This is generally the idea of how well a text can flow. So from each sentence you build an idea. That idea is expressed in a paragraph. The next idea is the next paragraph. And then you link these ideas together with linking words, and we'll talk about those a bit more later. Also, for organisation, think about how you can vary sentence length to make your writing more interesting. If every sentence is a long sentence, it will make your writing quite dull. But if you spice it up with a few short sentences here and there, it will be a lot more dramatic and a lot more interesting. And then finally, you have to think about your language. Now, this is not just vocabulary and grammar as you might expect, but more what level are you aiming at? If you write a perfect piece of writing with no mistakes, but very simple vocabulary, present simple grammar, present continuous maybe, you're not going to get as many points as if you aim a bit higher. If you try to use third conditional but you make a small mistake, the examiners will be much more forgiving than if you try to use third person singular in the present simple and make a mistake there. So let's have a look at some of the different forms of writing in the exam, and the first one we need to look at is the essay. This is what will come up in part 1. So you know this. You know that it's going to be an essay, so you can prepare yourself for that. So now that you know this, you should spend a lot of time looking at examples, going through the various exam books that there are. If you're at the school, you'll probably have a book to help you prepare for the exam. Look at the examples and practice. Write essays. You'll have a topic to write about. If you have a look in a minute at the example in the Cambridge Handbook, you'll see you have to discuss 2 points that will be provided for you, and you'll have to think of an idea of your own. Okay, so now you can pause the video here very briefly just to have a quick look at the handbook, have a look at the first part and see what the instructions say. Okay, so here we're going to focus on the content of the task. So what would you need to actually include to do well in the exam? If you've got somebody with you can talk about, then you can do this, otherwise think on your own. But for the 2 points that we've got, the first one, here we're looking at the problems in the world with pollution and damage to the environment. So the 2 problems that are introduced are transport and rivers and seas. So how would you introduce these ideas? How would you develop them? And then how would you state if the problem can be solved? You only need 1 or 2 sentences for each of these areas, but you build it up. And then if you do this 3 times with an introduction and a conclusion, you'll have enough content to last you through the exam. And think of your own idea as well. Okay. So let's move on and have a look at some of the different writing types that we have in the exam. The number of writing types is a lot smaller than it used to be. There are now only these: an article, an email or letter, a review, a report in the FCE for adults, and a story for FCE for schools. Now a quick mention at this stage of the difference. Really, there's no difference between FCE and FCE for schools. The certificate that you get if you pass will just say FCE. It won't say for schools or anything like that. So really the difference is just in terms of the content of the exam, the topics that it talks about. In the speaking, the questions that you'd get, or even just your partner. Some people who want to take this exam and they're only 13 years old might feel a little bit shy or embarrassed to be taking the exam with somebody in their 40s or 50s. They also have different world experience to talk about. So it's good that these 2 differences exist. It's hard to see many people at school needing to be able to write a report, just as it's harder to see people working in an office needing to write a story. So it's good that there's this split. So let's have a quick look at the review. Again, have a look at the handbook, keep that open with you. And like I've been saying so far, it's really important to remember what the target reader wants. Now in this case, a target reader, the person who's reading your review, is somebody who is considering purchasing this book, for example, or is thinking about going to see a film, and they want to be able to decide whether or not to go to the cinema or read this book. So, in your review, you should talk about the quality of the writing, if we take this book as an example. Was it well written, or was it a bit cheesy? Was it a bit too simple? How about the plot? Was the plot interesting? Maybe think about the characters. You could look at it from a particular standpoint. You could say, for example, that the characters are very interesting, but that they lack diversity. There's not much difference between the main characters, or you don't really understand the motivation of the characters. These different sorts of criticism would be very useful to somebody who wants to decide if they're going to buy this book. But be very careful about spoiling the plot too much. Don't give away the ending. Don't say, for example, Snape kills Dumbledore. Nobody wants to hear that. That would be annoying. At the end of a review, your opinion or your recommendation should be clear. If it's not clear enough from the details that you give, make it explicit at the end. Finish with a sentence like, I thoroughly recommend reading this book. It's a life changer. Something like that. You should try and balance being informative with being interesting. A review is not a direct, dry report. Don't simply relay information about the book, for example, but try to make it an interesting review so the person would want to actually read it. So again, here you can pause to look at the example in the handbook. And now we're going to focus on communicative achievement. So if you remember, this is using the format of the task and being interesting. So how do you get a high mark? Well, remember to keep the target reader informed. They want to be mildly entertained, but at the end of the day, they want to know if they should buy this book. So think of ways to complete the task. You could think about writing a book review yourself. What would you tell your friend about the book you've just read? So imagine that. If you find it difficult to do a piece of writing, you can always change it into a spoken activity just in your head. So imagine you've just finished reading a book, you want to tell your friend about it. What would you say? How would you make it interesting when you told your friend? So next we want to look at an article. And articles are quite similar to reviews in many ways. So let's have a look. Again, remember the target reader. The target reader is somebody who wants to read this article. They're interested in the topic, so you already have their attention, but in the real world they're likely to have paid to get access to this article. Maybe it's an article in a magazine or something like that. Okay, maybe if it's on the web, there probably won't be payment involved, but there is payment in another form, which is their time. And if an article is boring, people won't want to read it. They'll just give up and move on to the next shiny object on the internet, maybe a cat video. So your writing really has to be interesting here more than anything else, so that the person reading it will find some satisfaction in continuing. And a good way to do that is to make sure that they feel informed. So at the end of the article they can say, I enjoyed myself there and I feel like I know a little bit more. So again, you can pause just here and have a look at the handbook. So let's focus on language. How can you get a high mark for language? Well, let's think about it. So look at the task and the things that you have to write about, and for each of the points, so things like what's the most useful thing you have learned. Now think of a great expression you can use to talk about this. And think of a few different grammatical structures you can use as well. Remember that in the exam you don't really get any credit for copying from the question. So if you begin your sentence with, the most useful thing I have learned is, boom, 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 that's not going to be very helpful to you. So think of some other ways that you could address that. You could say, I've been fortunate enough to learn many great things in my time, but amongst the most useful must be boom, 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 and then introduce it that way. It helps if you can get really specific here. So think about your own life. Is there anything that you've learned about that nobody else really can talk about? Is there any vocabulary connected to that area that you could then use? The more specific, the better. Okay, and then the last one we're going to look at in detail here from the handbook is the email. So with any writing type, again, remember the target reader. And the target reader is somebody who has written to you. They really want to reply to their email. They've sent you an email and they want to reply. If you don't answer the questions in their email, you haven't really succeeded at replying. So have a look very closely at the task. Highlight the questions that you have to answer and go through them one by one. Also, if it's an informal email, like we have in the example here, it's your English-speaking friend, try to treat them like they are a friend. And remember that when you're writing to them. Don't write to them, "In reference to your email of the 19th." That's not a very good start. Take advantage of the task type, however. You're writing to a friend, perhaps it's taken you longer to reply to them than you wanted to, so you could start with something creative. "Dear David, I'm so sorry for not having written to you sooner, but you see, I fell down the stairs recently and broke both legs. It's been quite difficult to get around, and I didn't get to the computer until just this morning." Something like that. Don't take up too many words with it, but you could kind of come up with something like this ahead of time, remember it, go into the exam, write it down, and you've already got a couple of nice sentences with some really good grammar. It starts you off very nicely. So, have a look at the example in the handbook. You can pause here for a moment. Let's have a look at the organisation involved in writing this letter. How can you get a high mark for organisation? Well, how many paragraphs are you going to use, and what will each contain? Remember that we talked about what a paragraph is. A paragraph is an idea. Several sentences that contain parts of an idea, and you develop that idea, make it bigger, you make it complete. So how many complete ideas do you need for this task? And what will you put in each one? And think about varying sentence length. Take one of the questions. So, can you tell me about some of the places they could visit? Think about how to use long and short questions there. For example, you could use the sentence, there are many places that you can visit, of course. London, for instance. So there, the answer is a very short sentence, and then you develop the idea in the next time. So let's have a quick look at the report. This is the last piece of writing that the students will have to do. Again, remember who the target reader is and what they want. They want information. They've actually probably asked for it themselves. Most of the time when you write a report, you write it for your manager at work. So they want this information, they want it quickly. And this is why it's very important to use headings. We use headings in a report so that your manager can just look at the section that contains the information they want. They might not read the whole report in one go. They might read pieces of it now and again. They might never read all of it. That's quite likely, really, with most managers. So you want them to be able to get at the information quickly. Don't waste time on a long introduction. Why not? Well, the person who's going to read this report already asked you to write it. They don't need justification. They don't need to know why you wrote it. They told you to write it. So a sentence is really enough just to remind your manager, let's say, of the reason that you're writing this. So let's have a look at an example ourselves. So you've now looked at the writing paper in some detail. Write a report about your own writing skills. Which skills do you feel that you are strongest in, and which do you think that you still need to work on? Detail these weaknesses and talk about how you're going to improve them. Then, if you've got a partner with you, somebody you can talk to, talk about how you're going to organise your report and include details of the headings you will use. Okay, so hopefully this short video has helped you get some ideas for the FCE exam. If you need some further help, please leave a comment below the video and I'll try my best to answer it for you. Let's go over some last few ideas before we finish though. First of all, I see a lot of students doing this. Please don't waste your time counting words. If you've had enough practice of writing for the FCE, and you need a lot of practice before you do the exam, you'll know how long 140 to 190 words is. You'll have a feel for it. You'll see it written down, you'll see that that's about right. So spend your time looking for mistakes, especially articles. Everyone forgets articles. Look at every noun in your writing and tell yourself, is it the first time I've mentioned it? Is it one of a kind? Is it an abstract idea? What kind of article should go with this? And also, if you've double spaced your writing, in other words, if you write on one line but not the next, and then on the next line yes but then no, you've left a bit of space so you can make changes. Maybe go back through and change one or two of the words like very or quite for a more sophisticated word like astonishingly. Always remember who you're writing for. I mean, this point I really can't make strongly enough. If you remember who the writing is for, you'll do a lot better. The truth itself is just not important. You know, a lot of students waste a lot of time trying to think of a book that they've read recently or about something that they've learned. None of this is important. This is a test of your English ability. It's not a test of how much culture you have taken in your life. So if you can't think of something to write about, simply make something up. And the same is true for the speaking. If you can't think of something that you want to say about yourself, just say something good. You want to pass this exam. The examiners won't remember you 5 minutes later. In fact, they'll try not to remember you. They want to give you a good mark, get you out of the room, next person. Same with the writing. Give them something interesting to read. If it's true, that's fine, but if it's not, it doesn't matter. And please, make as much use as you can of all the examples available to you. So read through the book that you've got here, the PDF. Later in the PDF, there's a wonderful section that gives some real examples of students writing from past exams, and it grades them. It tells you which areas are good and which areas are bad, and that kind of thing. It's really very, very useful. And of course, practice as much as possible. Okay, well, I hope that's helped.